Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending this very poignant discussion. And thank you also to the Journalist Support Committee for having arranged tonight's proceedings. Let me be forthright. We shouldn't have to be here tonight, and the Journalist Support Committee shouldn't have had to organise tonight's discussion. Why? Because if British media, by which I mean British mainstream media, did the job what it claims to do, then the British public would be aware of the catastrophic war in Yemen, and hence tonight's meeting would not be necessary. But alas, the war in Yemen is an unknown war in Britain on account of British media. Now, the ongoing war in Yemen is one of the most horrific that the Middle East has known in recent times, and is one of the most appalling that the world has known, certainly in the last quarter of a century. According to some estimates, over 600,000 Yemeni people have been killed and injured during the war, which is now in its third year. And the war is showing no signs of stopping or even abating. The war in Syria pales in comparison to the war in Yemen, with 22 million Yemeni civilians, 3/4 of the population, in need of aid and protection. Indeed, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said that the war in Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis today. But despite the extraordinary depravity of the war in Yemen, British media only covers it from time to time, and when it does so, its coverage is sanitised. Even the photographs and footage of Yemeni babies and toddlers torn to shreds, burnt alive, or hideously disfigured is not enough to persuade British media to afford serious and extensive coverage to the war in Yemen. So we have to ask the question, why is British media indifferent to the war in Yemen and with it, the suffering of the Yemeni people? Well, it's certainly not the case that British media doesn't cover wars in the Middle East or doesn't have the resources to cover such wars, because British media, along with American media, has arguably been the most active in the world in covering the conflict in Syria. So why the silence on Yemen? Well, there are three reasons for why British media is neglecting the war in Yemen. Firstly, British media is neither free nor independent. Secondly, Saudi Arabia is the cause of the bloodshed in Yemen. And thirdly, British-made weapons are responsible for a high percentage of the civilian death toll in Yemen, including babies and toddlers. Let me take the first factor concerning the very nature of British media. The existence of a free and independent media is crucial to the functioning of a democracy, and indeed, Britain projects itself at home and abroad as having a free and independent media which conforms to the highest of standards. But just how true is that projection of British media? Well, in the context of foreign affairs, which is the focus of my speech tonight, the projection of the UK having a free and independent media is a facade. And the notion put forward by British politicians and journalists alike that news channels such as BBC and newspapers such as The Times, The Guardian or The Daily Telegraph being credible outlets is nothing but preposterous nonsense, absurdity at its most absurd. Because the press in Britain is neither free nor independent, and its journalists are not genuine journalists, but instead are ideologically driven foot soldiers of the British establishment who believe in American global hegemony supported by the UK, and whose job is to defend and maintain the West's dominance of the international arena and to ensure that British foreign policy is promoted as moral, ethical, and legal. Simply being aware of who owns the news channels and newspapers in Britain straight away contradicts the idea that Britain has an independent media. BBC News is funded and owned by the British state. Sky News, The Times, and The Sun are all owned by the right-wing businessman and proponent of American global hegemony, Rupert Murdoch. The Daily Telegraph is owned by David and Frederick Barclay, commonly known as the Barclay brothers, who are extremely influential amongst the British political elite and whose ideology is more or less identical to Mr. Murdoch's. The Daily Mail is owned by the aristocratic Jonathan Harmsworth, the fourth Viscount of Rothermore, and The Guardian is owned by Scott Trust Limited, a private company with an immense net worth and whose board members have links to, for instance, banking, venture investment and insurance, which are some of the domains of the British establishment. Alas, when you look at who owns the media in the UK, it doesn't look very free or independent. Indeed, every single mainstream media outlet in the UK is owned by powerful and wealthy forces, all of which have firm ideological convictions and all of which have firm ties to the political elite in Britain. Over the last 25 years, there have been major conflicts in the world, which have all involved the US and the UK, either directly or indirectly, from the wars in the former Yugoslavia, Croatia, Bosnia and Kosovo, to Iraq, to Libya, to Syria, and to Yemen. And throughout those wars, British media took or takes the exact same position as the British government, a carbon copy of the stance of the British government. Even the language employed by British media is identical to the language used by the British government. So, for instance, during the 1990s, the British government and British media both referred to the Serbs as mass murderers, genocide perpetrators, and who were striving for a greater Serbia, while today, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government are referred to by both the British government and British media as mass murderers who are waging a sectarian war against their own people and using chemical weapons in doing so. Let me cite another example. When the Syrian army began the campaign to liberate East Ghouta, the British government began saying that a humanitarian catastrophe was about to unfold, and then claimed chemical weapons had been used in the region by the Syrian government. And what was British media saying? The exact same, namely that a humanitarian catastrophe was about to unfold in East Ghouta and that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons in the area. And so, the language used by British media is indistinguishable from the language used by the British government when it comes to Syria or when it comes to the Balkans. So by looking at how British media covers wars, it is clear that there is a pattern. Whatever the stance of the British government is on a conflict, this will be the stance of British media. And whatever the stance of the British government is on a country, this will be the stance of British media as well. So that takes me to the second factor as to why British media is neglecting the war in Yemen, namely that Saudi Arabia is responsible for the conflict and with it, the death and destruction in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is a key friend and ally to the British government. Indeed, in terms of closeness, the UK's relationship with Saudi Arabia is second only to the UK's relationship with the US, and I would argue equal to the UK's relationship with Israel. It follows, therefore, that British media will also have a favourable opinion on Saudi Arabia. Let me just cite one example to corroborate what I'm saying. Think about the visit this March to the UK by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. Tell me, how did British media cover his visit? Were there front-page headlines and prime-time news reports on how bin Salman is closely associated with the various terrorist groups fighting in Syria, including ISIS? No. How about spotlight coverage on how bin Salman is directing the war against civilians in Yemen? No. How about hard-hitting reports on how Saudi Arabia is the leading exporter of religious extremism and terrorism in the world? No. Or how about leader columns focusing on Saudi Arabia's ideology, Wahhabism, as being ultimately responsible for the 2005 London terrorist attacks and the 2017 terrorist attacks in Manchester and London? Once again, nothing at all. So tell me, why was that? Why did Britain's free and independent press say not one major word about the malign influence of bin Salman and Saudi Arabia in general on the international stage? Is British media not aware of what Saudi Arabia is doing abroad? Is it merely a coincidence that every single UK mainstream media outlet happens to share the same view as the British government in regarding Saudi Arabia in a favourable way? No, that is not a coincidence. It is the case that British media did not run damning reports on bin Salman because British media is part of the British establishment, and a crucial one at that. Saudi Arabia is a dear friend to the UK government, therefore British media, like the UK government, turns a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's criminal, terrorist, murderous and dangerous acts, and instead presents Saudi Arabia in a glowing way, portraying the country as crucial in, for example, the fight against terrorism, which is how the UK government projects Saudi Arabia as being. Crucial in the fight against terrorism, how sickeningly offensive is that to the families of the victims murdered in Manchester and London by people whose ideology was Wahhabism and who listened to poisonous sermons from Saudi Arabia and who read depraved literature from Saudi Arabia, I tell you from now, UK media is not a friend to the British people, rather it is an enemy to the British people. We should also remember that during bin Salman's visit to the UK, British national newspapers sold advertising space to Saudi companies, with the Guardian newspaper, which claims to be a voice for human rights, running on 3 consecutive pages Saudi adverts promoting the Crown Prince's visit. Duplicity at its very worst, and yet another demonstration of how the Guardian and other British national newspapers are corporate. I defy the owners of the Guardian to sit down in the presence of Yemeni parents whose children have been slaughtered by the Saudis and tell them how the Guardian is committed to human rights. And allow me to remind you of how British media is barely saying anything, certainly nothing extensive, about the current Saudi onslaught against the port of Hodeidah in Yemen, which could result in a humanitarian disaster. British media's silence on Hodeidah reflects the British government's silence on Hodeidah. Now I arrive at the third factor for British media's apathy to the war in Yemen, that British weapons are responsible for much of the killing in Yemen. Since the beginning of Saudi Arabia's murderous war in Yemen just over 3 years ago, Britain's sales of weapons to Riyadh has increased by approximately 500%, with more than £4.6 billion worth of arms sold to the Saudis during the first 2 years of the war. British arms sales to the Saudis are therefore highly lucrative and key to the war that Riyadh is prosecuting against Yemen. For instance, Saudi Air Force pilots are trained by the UK. The missiles used by the Saudi Air Force against civilians in Yemen are British-made. Aeroplanes used by the Saudi Air Force are British ones, and Britain supplies maintenance parts to the Saudi Air Force. Hence, it is indisputable that Britain is a party to the Saudi war in Yemen, and so the UK is complicit in Saudi Arabia's massacring of Yemeni civilians. And it is that reality which helps to explain why British media does not make significant or meaningful coverage of Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen, because if it did, the British public would become aware that UK weapons are responsible for the violent deaths of tens of thousands of Yemeni civilians, including children, which would put under the spotlight relations between Britain and Saudi Arabia. And remember, as I said earlier, the British public has to be of the opinion that British foreign policy is sacrosanct, that Britain would never be responsible for the deaths of innocent civilians. British media exists in the context of international affairs to promote and defend UK foreign policy. Under no circumstances will British news channels or newspapers tell their viewers and readers about the depravity of Saudi Arabia's military campaign against Yemen, because this campaign is highly dependent on the UK. In short, the British cog in the Saudi war in Yemen has to be and is glossed over by British media. Now, I'm not a pessimist when I say that despite the horrific death toll in Yemen, British media will remain apathetic about the war there. Despite meetings such as the one here tonight, British media will not relent on ignoring Yemen. And despite all of our work on alternative media and social media, the UK media will maintain its indifference to the war against the Yemeni people. There will be no change whatsoever. No change, because British media is neither free nor independent. British media is a part of the British establishment. And allow me to quickly comment in the context of foreign affairs on the journalists who work for British mainstream media outlets. They care nothing for justice, truth, or morality. They are not sincere journalists. Rather, they are ideologically driven foot soldiers of the British establishment who sideline morality in pursuit of protecting and furthering Western global hegemony, and they are paid very handsomely for doing so. And let me add this. Many of those journalists at Christmas time and Easter time often talk of Christian values and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Well, let me tell you this. Those people are some of the most unchristian people you will ever come across. They have nothing in common with Jesus' teachings or Christian values. I would like to end my speech tonight by saying this. As a British person, I'm truly sorry to the Yemeni people for the actions of my government and my media. But whilst I'm not a religious person, I would like to offer the Yemeni people these words from the Quran. If Allah should aid you, no one can overcome you, but if he should forsake you, who is there that can aid you after him? And upon Allah, let the believers rely. Thank you very much.